Well, thank you. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak with you today. As he mentioned, I'm a assistant professor in political communication, so I'm in political science as well at LSU. I am in my 5th year here in Louisiana, moved down from Boston and Philadelphia for grad school, so still getting used to things around here. But I wanted to talk to you today about some of my own research, why I'm sort of interested in these topics, and then try to really zoom in on what's happening on the ground right now in the state of Iowa, which is first among states at the moment. It's a little random, it's a bit of a historical accident, but it is not possible to ignore the fact that Iowa is the most important state in the country right now as it comes to the presidential race now. I noticed that obviously we have a election here coming up, and they could have gotten many people other than me that know more about Louisiana politics. But hopefully I can give you guys a little respite from that, a little break. I know I'm following the governor, so I can't follow in those footsteps too easily. But we will hopefully be able to have some questions and answers about what's going on in the presidential race right now. Obviously a lot with the Liberty and Justice dinner last weekend. Hopefully we can talk about that today. So the sort of theme of my talk today is going to be, is all politics still local, right? So Tip O'Neill, famous quote, all politics is local. Went to my alma mater, Boston College. We have the Tip O'Neill Library there, so it's one I'm very familiar with. Doesn't seem to be the case as much anymore. We have a nationalizing trend in American politics where national concerns, national partisanship, the actions of national politicians, some of which will be in the state coming up here soon, seem to be driving voters' decisions even at the most local levels. And this is happening with media as well. There's a nationalization of political media that's happening in this country, whereas local news sources weaken, whether that's because of trends in print advertising, trends in consolidation of media ownership, reporter layoffs, sorry about that here. There are nonetheless trends where national content is filling in some of the gaps, right? So whether that's Gannett and Gatehouse merging and therefore getting rid of some level of local control at some of those local levels, Sinclair Broadcasting Company buying up TV news stations and increasing the amount of national content in there. There's a nationalizing trend in political media that kind of complements this nationalizing trend that we have in politics itself. And so that sort of tension between national and local politics, national and local information, but also the way that national and local politics now complement each other more than ever, has really been a focus of my research. As Harrison mentioned, one of those articles showed that where a local newspaper closes, political polarization increases as measured by split ticket voting. I'll talk a little bit about that here. But what I want to focus on mostly, as he mentioned, I was at the Iowa Steak Fry, which was an incredible event on September 21st. I want to talk about national campaigns in this local context, because what you have to do in Iowa as a person who almost all the time is not from there, is to make yourself seem like a local. And you have about a year to do it, right? And so you have to build a local organization. Another big part of my research agenda is campaign field offices, right? So how they invest resources in given communities, how they choose which communities get those field offices, how those field offices connect with and send volunteers and campaign staffers out to talk to voters. What does it mean to have these national campaigns in a local context, right? What does that look like on the ground in Iowa? And it was really interesting to see it in person after being a pointy-headed professor who was just writing about it. Really getting out there and getting my sneakers muddy and all that out there in Iowa was really interesting for me. So that's going to sort of be a case study of what I hope some of these dynamics are and how we're looking at that, right? So our interest, I'll start with my own research to sort of show you why I'm interested in this stuff. Split ticket voting is referred to in one of the seminal articles on the topic as a privilege almost unique to the American electorate, right? Americans do this where you vote for one party at one level and another party at another level, you know, a Republican for president, a Democrat for attorney general, a independent for state senator, right? Americans used to do that quite frequently. Europeans didn't, right? Europeans have this strong party model where you vote the party up and down the ticket, right? But as American reforms have gotten rid of straight ticket voting, and in general, they're in the middle of the century, with the Australian ballot getting rid of the partisan ballot, there was a real trend in the 50s when that article was written towards significant split ticket voting and a real jumbling up of what the parties represented and what their ideologies and positions were, right? And so this was sort of assumed to be something that Americans did a lot, actually concerned political scientists back in those days, because they were saying things like, we can't get any signals out of this electorate. What does this electorate want? They keep voting for different parties up and down the ballot at different positions, right? And so maybe fortunately, unfortunately now, that trend has largely, in some ways, gone to the wayside. There was not one state in 2016 that voted for president in a different way that it voted for senator. It's the first time that's happened in 100 years in America, right? And so that trend was somewhat worrisome to me and my colleagues, because you ideally want people to have enough information to not just rely on party when they step into the ballot box. And that's a media question, right? That's a media problem. How much does the media have the ability to talk to inform people about candidates up and down the ballot to maybe break with the pull of partisanship? Otherwise, we end up with partisanship determining everything, right? Which is, again, how things tend to happen, or at least tended to happen in Europe, right? So we looked at areas where a local newspaper had closed to try to get some variation on where there was less local news all of a sudden, right, where we could sort of measure that there was a drop in that, and that included mergers as well, sort of a consolidation of local press. And we did a couple of tests that I'll talk about a little bit, not too much, that showed us that what happens when people lose local news is that they just start going to national news, right? National information is more plentiful, more available than ever before. You have so much national information about national politics. Anybody can subscribe to the New York Times. Anybody can subscribe to the Washington Post. Anybody can get social media content that goes viral that is going to want to be most relevant to the most number of people, and that's going to end up being national information, right? So we're in this golden age of information about national politics, if you want to call it that, and we're in an era where local content is dropping as a share of the amount of information in the media marketplace, right? So the available replacements are polarizing, right? There's this, we often think of like, well, media can be polarizing because we've now got all these extra partisan outlets in the media, right? Addition, polarization by addition. We're talking about polarization by subtraction here, where if you lose a local news source, people are going to turn to national news. It's going to have stronger party cues. It's going to make them think about party as they step into the ballot box. It's going to be more polarizing for them, right? Audiences also kind of prefer national content. You may have noticed this, right? If you give people a choice in an experimental context, they'll choose news about national politics more than they'll choose news about their local politics, right? So this is being driven by audience preferences, and it's partially being driven by failures of online news. There is not necessarily a vibrant online news ecosystem springing up to replace closed local newspapers. There's good examples of positive online local news sources, but in general, they're not making up for what's been lost, right? So it's not just about loss of knowledge, it's not just about loss of engagement or awareness. What our research shows, and what we tried to prove here, is that the loss of local news nationalizes political decision making. It makes people carry a different set of considerations into the ballot box. And as a result, there is less split ticket voting. So that's what we find. We find 1.9% less split ticket voting in areas where a newspaper closed when we match counties on statistical things that might also be meaningful in a way that we don't need to get into the details of here. We're able to show that we probably didn't miss any meaningful variables, that when a newspaper closed after the election instead of before the election, there was no effect, right? So it's not just the kind of places that lose a newspaper are more polarized, it's actually losing a newspaper that does the polarizing in that way. And there's not an increase in ballot roll-offs. This doesn't, which is where you leave races blank further down the ballot. You only vote for the top of the ticket, and then you don't vote for state auditor or whatever, right? And so it doesn't seem like it's about information loss. It does seem like it's about people taking national cues and in so doing, voting in a more polarized, more partisanly consistent way, right? Now this study got a lot of attention from the press because it basically just argues that newspapers need to stay open. We don't measure content in any way in the study. As long as you don't close, it seems like there's positive effects to that. journalists liked that one. And so we actually got a decent amount of coverage and prominence from that, and we're very happy about that as well, right? So that's sort of indicative of where my research is. I have other research that shows local news contributes to local political awareness. If you read a lot of local news, you do know more about your local candidates for office. National news actually harms it, is actually a net negative effect. If you read more national news, holding local news consumption constant, you know less about the candidates running for office in your district, right? So again, that tension between local and national is really what drives me. Moving into the meat of the talk here, campaign field offices, I have a couple papers showing that they lead to more and more positive local coverage for presidential campaigns. So there's media effects to field organization because they create events, right? They create excitement in local events in that way, and I show that across a couple of elections. Mm-hmm. And in my most recently published paper, I show that there was less field organization in 2016 than there was in 2008 or in 2012. It was less aggressive. There was less of it on both sides. And so that seemed to be a downward trend in the way that field was being deployed in these different elections. And field's doing a lot of really important work, right? Field is knocking on doors. You're having real conversations. You're having phone calls with the people who pick up. You're doing visibility. You're showing enthusiasm. You're doing the kind of things that lead to person-to-person contact that almost all the political science research shows is the most effective way to move votes and to sort of get people engaged in that way, right? They coordinate all those GOTV activities. They indicate that you're invested in these areas. And in that way, they get voters engaged, right? And field offices I focus on because they give the campaign sort of a central place to work. They're not the only place that these events happen, but they are fairly important for that, right? So if we're going to talk about Iowa, we have to start, if we're going to talk about the Democratic primary in Iowa, which I will because it's interesting right now. The Obama campaign in 2008 is the place to start because the Obama campaign in 2008 in Iowa completely changed how Iowa works, completely changed the game in that way. They increased participation participation was up by about double. They had 37 field offices open in the state. Not one campaign right now has more than 22, right? So they're at almost double the amount of field investment. There's still time for today's candidates to catch up, but they do need to get going if they're going to because we're fewer than 100 days out, right? And he did so in a different Iowa, right? He did so in a different time, and I think that's important to note when we start to look at the differences there, right? So how do the candidates compare so far? Most of them are in the same places, right? There's only so many cities in Iowa worth investing in that way. But the Obama campaign took a very different sort of approach to this. The two campaigns with the most field offices in Iowa right now are Elizabeth Warren and Pete Buttigieg. Right, they're at about 20, 21, 22, depending on the count. It's actually really hard to get a solid count on these things, it turns out. And those campaigns, it was very clear to me while I was there, were the ones that were investing the most in field. And I'll talk about that in the context of the stake fry once I go through a little bit more of that. They tend to be in safer Democratic locations than Obama's was, right? Again, Obama's got about 15 more of these in 2008 than the candidates today have currently. And so, for example, there's a couple counties where Obama had an office where no Democrat currently has an office, right? And that includes the 11 offices that presumably Beto O'Rourke closed last week, right? When he unexpectedly dropped out mere hours before a major volunteer event, which is generally not how you want to treat your volunteers, if I had to guess. But there's 7 counties in Iowa that I wanted to focus on that had Obama offices but do not currently have any Democrats' offices, right? So in northeast Iowa, eastern Iowa tends to be more Democratic, right? So there's more Democratic investment in those areas because delegates are awarded based on how Democratic an area is in the Democratic primary, right? So in Fayette County, the difference between Obama's 2008 general election performance and Trump's 2016 general election performance was 20 points, 20.6. Trump did better than Obama. There was a 20-point shift toward Trump. Clayton County, 22% shift toward Trump. Bremer County, 14%. Floyd County, 20%. Huge, huge, huge shifts in counties that Obama won in 2008, right? So rural counties shifting toward Trump in larger ways than we thought maybe feasible, right? As political scientists, we've had to do a lot of sort of soul searching about how we got 2016 wrong. Missing these major shifts in rural counties is sort of where we've settled. and where every election since continues to show us that. And even 2018, I mean, even when Democrats took back some of these House seats, the rural gaps remained, right? Now, Republicans aren't voting in the Iowa caucuses. They'd have to register as Democrats to do so. So it's interesting to me that these counties are still being avoided even in a primary context, right? As a field person, you don't want to organize the wrong people. That's probably your main goal, is to not knock on the wrong doors and get your opponent's voters out, right? But that's not really the case here, because they're just trying to find Democrats. Democrats have pretty good lists in that way. And in southeast Iowa, there's two very similar ones. They're all in eastern Iowa, these differences. They are about between 15 and 20 points, again, right? So Democrats aren't going to the places where the Trump vote shifted toward Trump and away from Obama, it seems like. And I don't know why, because it's primary, right? So if there is a additional field investment, which I'll be tracking as we go up to the election, I have all this data in preparation for an article for 538 that I'm preparing that'll hopefully be out in the next couple of weeks. It's clear the candidates are not matching Obama's investment, and they're not invested in rural counties that flipped to Trump by these 15 to 20% in a way that Obama did. Obama's campaign had more field offices than Hillary's did, than any Republican has ever had, because they would go into counties that they weren't going to win, and they'd find the Democratic voters there, and they'd get them out. That does not seem to be happening here, right? So that's my main takeaway from this initial sort of thing that I found, right? So again, I tend to be bean counting behind a computer for this stuff as a professor, so it was really exciting to me to be able to actually get out to Iowa and actually see some of these field offices in action. Campaigns are super secretive about field. They'd often smile at me and kind of usher me out the door when I try to enter their field offices, unless it was an event. I end up going to a lot of office openings because they can't kick you out because it's a public event. Journalist tricks the political scientists don't know. Anyway, I was there for a week. I put 1,400 miles on my rental car. I drove all around eastern Iowa. I went to the Steak Fry where 17 candidates spoke, and I went to events for what I saw at the time as the top 6 candidates, which I stand by, which is, in some order, Warren, Biden, Sanders, Buttigieg, Klobuchar, and Harris. Right, so I went to individual events for each of those candidates, and the Steak Fry where everybody was. So I kind of got a good chance to see how the campaigns approach these events and how they and what they did to do that, right? So the first event I went to was Elizabeth Warren in Iowa City, on the campus of the University of Iowa, right? She got about 2,000 people there. I did get a selfie, I will say. I stood in the selfie line because I wanted to see what happened after, quite frankly. And I was immediately, they shoved a commit to caucus card in my face as soon as I got down off of the ladder onto the stage where Elizabeth Warren was after we'd taken our picture, right? They're trying to convert what they see as a unique advantage of their campaign, simply because nobody else is doing it, into commits, right? So that selfie line is not only there for the social media exposure that people get when they immediately post it to their social media networks, it's there to actually get people to sign up at the moment of presumably their highest amount of excitement with the campaign because they just took a picture with the candidate, right? So that is a very efficient process. You hand your belongings to someone, you hand your phone to someone else, you step up next to Elizabeth Warren, they take like 5 pictures, you step down, you get a commit to caucus card. Right? It is a well-oiled machine. That's how they've taken 60,000+ of them, right? And they're really making it work for them. No other campaign's doing it. I don't really know why. It's something that they could do. I guess it's a lot of work. And I'm just going to rapid fire kind of go through these because I know I have a limited amount of time. I went to a very small event with Joe Biden in Cedar Rapids. It was at a completely carbon neutral, eco-friendly nature center thing, and it was about global warming. The event, nominally. It was also like 100 degrees, so it worked. It was very effective. Biden was sweating through his shirt a little bit, more than he probably wanted to. But this is just my opinion, and again, I was there as an observer, but there's a sense that they want to keep him on script and not have him talk to voters. I actually found the opposite. I found he was much more compelling when he was out in the audience talking to voters and was a bit hurried when he's on script. That was just my opinion. Again, I thought it was an interesting event. It was probably the smallest event I went to with the presumed frontrunner at the time. So that was pretty interesting. Amy Klobuchar is making a very big investment in Iowa. I would not count out Amy Klobuchar. I would not ignore Amy Klobuchar. She went last, or second to last, at the Liberty and Justice dinner, formerly the Jefferson Jackson dinner, in in Des Moines the other night, but got a very good reception there. She's gotten a good reception just about anywhere. She's from a neighboring state. She's got a pretty extensive network of field offices. I was at the opening of one. I was at the opening of her Cedar Rapids one, and they are all in on Iowa, and she hasn't had her moment yet, but if it happens, I wouldn't be surprised, I would say. I think you don't need to be winning 90 days out, you need to be winning 4 days out. And that's sort of where she's heading. I don't know if she'll be in that top 5 or not in that way. I'll skip ahead a little bit. I went to an Andrew Yang office opening, which was very interesting, I will say. Very well attended. They were not ready for it. I heard a conversation between staffers that would have made the Warren campaign cringe, which was, we should really get out commit to caucus cards. Where are they? Oh, I think they're back in the storage closet. Oh yeah, you think you can go get those? Okay, this is after Andrew Yang is walking out, right? So it was their first office. I'll cut them a little slack, but it was interesting to see in person. It also was way too crowded. It was spilling over into the hallway, down the stairwell. It was a very small office. Actually, I've since seen that Elizabeth Warren has opened an office in the very same building. So that's Big Office Park building in West Des Moines. Went to a Bernie Sanders campaign ice cream social. They're exploiting the Ben & Jerry's endorsement of their campaign with a lot of ice cream. And every Sanders rally is the same, I will say. So it was actually the only event I was ever put through security of any kind. Interestingly, I don't know what the takeaway is there, but it stood out, right? And finally, right after the steak fry, I'll introduce the steak fry by saying this. I went to a Pete Buttigieg rally in Newton, Iowa. It was in a middle school because they were worried about rain. It was supposed to be in the town square, and it looked like it was supposed to be in the middle school the whole time. They had a huge sign up made out of Pete signs that said Pete 2020. Beautiful stage, really well organized event. They're a very efficient campaign. They have a lot of money and they are spending it. So that was sort of my some of the differences between campaigns I saw in the steak fry that may or may not pan out as meaningful differences. First of all, you have to understand the geography of the steak fry. There is a large parking lot around which every campaign got a space to organize. Right, so they had a set space for their people to get together beforehand, and so I was just walking around the parking lot all morning. This was exactly what I wanted to see. Right, I didn't care about the speeches. I wanted to see how they were organizing. The Warren campaign, every group part of their organizing space was full of circles of people, organizers training volunteers to go organize during the event. The Pete campaign was huge. They bought 2 spaces next to each other. They'd bought everybody's tickets for them and given them t-shirts, and they were all crowded around a stage, waiting for Buttigieg to show up. His bus was there. He was leaving immediately from the event to go on a bus tour of Iowa. Nobody showed up for Sanders. There was nobody in the Sanders organizing area at all. By design, they did bring a door, and taped to the door was a sign that said, "We're not here, we're out knocking doors." So that was their choice. Klobuchar had a good organizational area. Michael Bennett had a group where it seemed like people were just sort of throwing a football around, and then they decided they needed signs, and then the signs fell down. You notice these little details; they probably don't mean anything, but I thought it was funny. So yeah, the Pete campaign had a huge presence because of all the T-shirts, bright yellow T-shirts, huge signs. They laminated their signs, which was very effective because it was raining, right? So they thought of everything. But as soon as I got in, I noticed that the Pete campaign's people were standing in line for steaks. When the Warren campaign's people were organizing, they had green balloons taped to their backs so that you knew where all the Warren people were. You knew you could find a Warren clipboard wherever you saw a green balloon. Right, so this was a very clear tactic. Warren had the good fortune to go fourth, immediately went to the back for the selfie line. The crowd thinned out. The organizers started canvassing the selfie line. Right, so every interaction you have with voters, what are you getting out of it? That's where the organizational part comes in. And there's immense resources, much bigger than a statewide campaign would ever have, being poured into this and into these events all at the same time. Iowans are responding. This was the biggest steak fry ever, 12,000 voters in attendance. So I had some pictures I was going to show, but in general, where does this leave us, right? We've got about a 4-way tie in Iowa, but again, 2 campaigns are very clearly ahead when it comes to field offices and organization. National polls are to be ignored. I think we all know that, but it's hard to realize that when you're in it because everything's going to change after Iowa. At least 5 candidates are going to drop out the day after Iowa, if I had to guess. And the candidates with the organization are going to be able to pack it up and move it into the Super Tuesday states and really get this thing kicked off on the day after the Super Bowl, February 3rd, 2020, when the Iowa caucuses happen. So happy to talk to you about any of that, answer any of your questions, and thanks again for having me. Yeah.
So I don't know if you asked this question, looked at this question in your research, but you talk about the impact, the polarization impact when newspapers close. Would you expect something similar when the newspaper stays open, but cuts staff, cuts local content, fills it out with water copy, that kind of thing?
No, that's a really important consideration. Actually, the Center for Innovation, Sustainability, and Local Media at UNC Chapel Hill has a really interesting report out about ghost newspapers, as they call them, where like the masthead exists, but the content is all farmed out. Obviously, that's an extreme, but that happens. I mean, that where you're bringing in more non-original local content. So we would need really finely grained data over time on that, paired with exactly what the vote share was on that. So that's probably a next phase for this kind of research. When you're looking at these questions, you like that nice clean causal break that you get when a newspaper closes, but it's probably a very similar dynamic in that but then again at the same time, we're talking about essentially a substitution effect. So sure, they're substituting towards more national content in the local paper. We're talking about people substituting into national content themselves, like choosing to read more nationalized sources. So it's probably just a weaker version of the same dynamic, but UNC is the place with the data to test that. Yeah.
What do you think the percent of people that get a newspaper is now compared to getting their information from the TV or social media? I mean,
Yeah.
is it even 10%?
It's probably over 10%. Yeah, I don't know the exact Pew because it changes, but the exact Pew is the place that keeps track of this as well. It is smaller than TV. TV is still by far the largest source. Local TV news is a huge portion of this. The thing about newspapers is they drive the local information economy and they drive the local information environment. And so even if people aren't reading them in a print edition, the reporting the newspapers do is driving the agenda, driving the sort of what stories are getting covered, what things are being looked at in those areas. Again, I'm in a group of reporters, but that's sort of the understanding that we have of it anyway. So a newspaper continuing to exist does and should have impacts outside of its subscriber base, and many of the studies of this don't have any sort of individual level reception measures. I've done some work on that, trying to figure out what's a better way to measure actual media consumption instead of just assuming everybody gets some benefit from the newspaper even if they don't read it. But getting people to accurately tell you what media they use is extremely difficult. So I think it is smaller than TV and it's smaller than local media.
When Truman beat Dewey, they said it because they used landlines, and many of the Americans didn't have landlines.
That's right.
You're using Obama's election as sort of a fence post to make decisions. But wouldn't you also have to take into account that in many ways on lower income, a lot of people in the population, newspapers are now expensive. So what used to be a universal device is no longer. And also, we've had a huge change. If you thought about your great-grandmother, she wouldn't let go of the dollar because she lived through, you heard the rumors, through the Depression.
Yeah,
You look at the next generation, they had World War II, television wasn't invented, and by Korea, there's only 3 channels.
Right.
Those people are dying out. So have you really taken into account a broader picture than what you're representing here of the information that you've accumulated by firsthand visit to Iowa, that maybe there are much broader trends that in effect?
There undoubtedly are, and that's part of the challenge of being a social scientist, is you're always swimming against several currents that you don't know are there, right? And you tend to figure them out after the fact. And this is the thing about studying elections, is you try to predict them and then you figure out what you missed completely. And then by the time you're done having a preliminary answers to that, you're on to the next one, right? So when I talk about Obama's election as a fence post, I know 2008 was a long time ago, especially in a state like Iowa. Right. I'm looking at a very specific institutional arrangement, which is where can Democrats go in the primary that's in one state? That's this weird historical trend where Carter decided he was going to compete in it, and as a result, everybody's done it ever since. Right, because it happened to be first because they needed the Des Moines Convention Center for something. I mean, these are the weird paths we end up going down, where, from a historical perspective, again. I think a lot of the hand-wringing after the 2016 election has been in response to what did we miss online, right? What did we miss in terms of social media? What did we miss in terms of Facebook? What did we miss in terms of misinformation? I've not focused on that as much. I'm interested in, like you say, the what's going away, what's not going to be there, what's changing in the way that people know things about their own communities, right? Apps like Nextdoor are a huge part of this story. We know very little about it as scholars, right? In terms of what people are bypassing city information to get like their exact neighborhood's information, and we just don't. We're trying to catch up as all these technological, societal, political trends are running full stop. So if you can find as a social scientist a neat break somewhere like a newspaper closing, like zoom in on that. There's probably a lot of other stuff going on. You can do the best job you can, right? And so that's sort of where I've had to try to focus, but I would be very suspicious of someone who said they had all the answers of why one thing happened in politics. Yeah.
It used to be, just a generation or two ago, that an endorsement from a newspaper meant something.
Yes.
In a statewide election or a national election. But nowadays, as a result of the mergers and consolidations and business decisions, they just don't do that as much. But do you believe, have you did any analysis of that? And do you think we're missing something now that's not happening?
Endorsements generally used to be a bigger deal. Endorsements from other politicians as well. I think we're seeing another election where no other politicians there's very low levels of endorsement by other politicians. With regard to newspaper endorsements, that rests on the authority and the reach of the paper, as you note, right? And so if the news, there is some evidence from the last 20 years that like a significant break in what a newspaper is doing can change the way people see things. It's actually a study from England that showed when they switched endorsement from Tory to Labour that their voters followed them in 2005, I think, the 2005 elections. Haven't seen a study like that in the US. It could be done because actually quite a few metro dailies that had traditionally endorsed Republicans did not endorse Trump or endorsed Clinton. So that could be part of a broader suburban trend or the suburban subscriber base of the paper. We have seen, as I mentioned, the rural movement toward Trump. There's been a suburban movement away from Republicans, right? So newspapers could be leading with their principles or leading with their pockets there, I'm not sure. But they are, you've got to have a place of authority in the community and the reach to get people to actually read your endorsements. And so I think in general, it's a broader trend of people going away from endorsements generally. And we have this theory that political scientists have touted recently, saying the party decides and that endorsements really matter for who wins the nomination. The only problem is the last two cycles, nobody endorsed Trump, and nobody's endorsing in this current election. There's very, very few of them. And so endorsements generally are suffering.
But the problem to that is because, now that we have the focus on, the media, for the most part, being the enemy of the people, I'm saying, I think the media will, likely take an opportunity to state its position on some things now when in the past it might not have.
Maybe. Yeah, I think there's two trends there. One is a decline of trust in institutions generally, right? So people trust the media a lot less than they used to. They trust everything less than they used to in that way, right? And so And people are also not particularly good at distinguishing opinion from reported content. So there's a bit of a danger in doing an endorsement in a world with lower media literacy where people don't know the difference. And I mean, there's some political science work showing that editorial endorsements bleed over into the reported news page, and you can sense more bias when a paper is endorsed to a given candidate. That's a little bit old at this point, but is still sort of the most current work on it. But in general, it's something that newspapers have to decide if they want to do. And most of them still do, but a lot of them, you're also seeing, I think, a rise in these unendorsements, or not going to say I do vote for this person, but I'm going to say don't vote for that person. You know, that sort of thing that kind of lets them split the difference. Yeah.
I was reading an article the other day that said the majority of Americans really don't want truth. They want to hear what they believe is the truth. So you got extremes that kind of hibernate in their news cocoons and only listen to their side of the story. Is there any research that you know of that would look at what independent voters may like, or is there any research as to the response to something that will present both sides of the story?
So, yeah, media bubbles are a huge place of research today in today's world. There's actually, people who study media bubbles end up discounting their influence and say people actually get more cross-cutting media exposure than you'd think they would. There's a lot of political science research on independent voters, and they tend to act like partisans if you really get into it. Or they tend to be people who just don't like partisan politics. They're defined by what they don't like, the parties, either party, more than they are by a set of beliefs that they have that they want to be catered to, right? And so there's part of what I talked about with regard to the incredible influx of information into the world through online news and new media news sources and that sort of thing is you can probably find something that tells you that you're right? And people do often come to the news trying to feel that they're right, right? I mean, somebody telling you you're right is kind of a nice feeling, right? What people's motivations are for approaching the news is a really important question when you have a broader marketplace of choices. When you have 3 channels, it's not as important. When you have unlimited channels, we need to know why people are coming to the news. And my own advisor from grad school, Matt Lewandowski at Penn, has a paper trying to distinguish between those motivations that's actually pretty good, of people who want to know what's going on and people who want to be told they're right. And those are both powerful motivations. We should not discount one or the other, because we need to know why people are doing this. Why are people reading political news these days is a question that we should not ignore. And a good body of scholarship recently is actually looking at the question, why do people abstain? Right? What are these no news people doing? Why are they deciding to avoid political news? Maybe fairly obvious answers to that, but why are they deciding to avoid it? Benjamin Toff at the University of Minnesota is a real leading person on that particular thing, if you're interested in that. Sure.
Yep.
Can you apply your study to what's going on in our governor's race in that it's a very hard partisanship, which we have not seen in our governor's races?
Mm-hmm.
And there wasn't much interest in it up until the last few days.
It does seem to have
largely
kicked off.
because they weren't talking about issues.
Right. I have been here for, yeah.
Read that question.
Yeah, repeat the question, absolutely. So how can I apply the research to the governor's race in terms of the hard polarization that we've seen and people just getting interested in it in the last couple of days? I would say it makes sense that interest is spiking just before the election, right? And there does seem to have been more stories about that sort of thing coming here. Obviously, the general is going to get more of an interest in the primary. We have national actors coming in, the president coming in this week. There has been a shift that this isn't totally my research, but the shift towards Republicans and towards Trump in rural communities is, I think, the most important trend in recent elections, 2018 and beyond. And you're not going to lose money betting the over on rural turnout and rural conservatism in elections since Trump was elected. I would say in general, that's the bet you want to be making. So the whole geography of things have changed in that way, but they've changed in a pretty repeatable direction. And so which areas turn out is an important consideration in every election. That's the stock answer that everybody makes fun of, but it's true, and it's particularly true when the areas are so different. And so these nationalizing trends have very much come to Louisiana politics, I think, if you look at the primary results. All that with the big caveat that I've been here for 4 years. Louisiana politics is obviously very different. But in some ways, those nationalizing trends are evident. And they're evident in the same geographic context that they are just about everywhere else. Thank you.